Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Melbourne Traditionalists podcast, episode 24. I have with me today Mark Richardson from Oz Conservative. How are you, Mark?
I'm really well, thank you, Mark.
And David Hiscox from XYZ. How are you, David?
Very good, Mark. Thanks for having me. Happy New Year.
Thank you, and Happy New Year to you both. Now, you have brought along a book, Mark. No pun intended.
I got that one. Yep. Yeah.
Tell us about this, because it's a very important book.
It is an important book, and I'll briefly explain why. So it's a book called Our Borders, Ourselves, which I believe is a play on a feminist book, Our Bodies, Ourselves.
Yes.
It's written by the late Lawrence Auster. I think we've mentioned Auster before, but in case people missed, I'll just briefly recap. So Auster was, I think you could fairly say, the leading traditionalist in the early 2000s. He ran a website called View from the Right, which got hundreds of thousands of hits.
A month?
Yeah, a month. A very popular site. He had a very, I'd say, creative, analytical mind, I think you could say. So it was almost exciting to have intellectual exchanges with Lawrence Auster, as prickly a personality as he was. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2013, which was a great loss. But amazingly, and I just didn't expect it to happen, he had written a book, and no one had published that book. And it's now finally, or at least an abbreviated version of it, has been published. And I've just read it, and it's an important book. The reason it's important is because it actually focuses on something that we don't focus on a lot. We often focus on political liberalism.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I do that. So that's our unofficial state ideology, in my opinion, and it has certain assumptions to it which you can logically take apart, and that's relatively straightforward. But what Auster's doing is something a little bit different. He is sort of looking at aspects of Western belief that are a little bit separate to political liberalism. They're interconnected, but they're a little bit separate, which once really formed the basis of how we thought about things, but the memory of which is now lost to us. And he is talking about those things and how they came to be lost. So he talks about things like nihilism, for instance, in this book. He talks about the loss of the father in Western society.
Yep.
And the kind of the structuring principles that were once related to that. He talks about the loss of a belief in the transcendent. So these are things that are harder to talk about as a matter of pure logic, but which are really important in restoring aspects of our tradition. So it's like a half of what we should really be doing, and which I don't probably focus on enough. So I think for that reason, yeah, really important book.
Now, you and I talked about this in episode 10 of the Melbourne Traditionalists podcast. So if someone wants to find out more about Lawrence Auster, they can check that out.
Yep.
I've had a quick flick through the book. This is the first time that I've seen it. It's actually really exciting.
Yes.
To see it, to hold it. And I noticed on the back, I knew this, but it's published by VDare.
It is. They were the ones who finally were willing to publish it. He doesn't hold back punches. It's a very politically incorrect book.
Yep.
So it was never going to be published by a mainstream publishing company. So well done to VDare for doing it. I have to say that I do have one limited criticism of the book already.
Oh, sorry, and that's the end of the show.
And that criticism is because he focuses on that other half and not political liberalism, his timing for what he sees as the decline is probably a little bit different to mine, that he focuses very much on the 60s.
Yep.
Quite late in the piece. And I understand why he does it, because it was a time when the youth culture really did decisively overthrow that, the father, if you like, the structuring principles associated with that traditional authority. And he's right as well that up to that point in time, you did still have some of the traditional restraints on behaviour in terms of everyday culture, which we have subsequently lost. So I'm not denying any of those things, but when you still look at the massive changes to Western society, I think you have to push back. You can't ignore either the role of political liberalism and you can see signs of decline well before the 1960s.
Oh, absolutely. And, Nietzsche said in 1859, the death of God.
Yeah.
1859.
Yeah.
And he obviously didn't start this problem. It was been going on for a long time by 1859.
Well, that's right, and I think it shows that maybe those are the things that survive last are those informal manners in everyday life that they're the last bastions to fall, maybe.
Yeah. Now, I also want to talk about the bushfires. And, we've had really devastating bushfires. As much land has been burnt in Australia as there is in Scotland. So we're talking about really big fires. Lots of houses, something like 400, 500 houses have been destroyed. People are talking about 500,000 animals having been killed.
I've heard it's actually 1 billion.
Sorry, 500 million they said.
Yeah. I think it's and that's been raised up. Yeah.
And then they said 1 billion animals.
It's.
In reality, no one really knows. But
I understand that they've actually sent scientists out. They've already peer reviewed it as well, to actually count the number of dead carcasses. So it's the science has settled. It's 1 billion animals.
Yeah. All the science is settled. That's pretty controversial. And of course, the left has gone to town. David, give us your take.
Well, it's a racket. The
left's a racket. You heard it here first.
Yeah, the left have used the excuse of so-called climate change to I say the left, but it's both sides of government actually, to implement policies on the way that we manage our land. In order to mitigate so-called climate change. So it was the Howard government that locked up the national parks. They were supposed to be carbon sinks.
Yep.
And since then, what I understand is that they've closed down the fire trials. They've even they've just let them go. The people are getting arrested for just clearing wood off the sides of the roads. People are getting charged for managing their own land, for clearing their own land. And even though there was a Royal Commission after the Black Saturday bushfires here in Victoria, which recommended more hazard reduction burns, the Victorian government has just consistently failed to reach the targets which were set. They had hectare targets set, and they've sort of taken away those targets so they can be less accountable.
That's right. I read that the burns last year were 50% of what they were actually targeted to be.
Yeah. And so what I find, and so the reason this is a racket, they've used the excuse of climate change to basically institute policies which have led to the build-up of fuel, and that's the one thing that just makes fires in Australia go nuts. We understand that even before we got here, the Aboriginals used to burn the land.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's right.
And they see it as part of their cultural practice. So obviously that implies that originally when the Aboriginals got here, they were a lot more intelligent, and they understood, hey, we have to reduce the fuel loads here in Australia, and over time that's just become part of their culture, and they just do it.
Yep.
And so what we've been doing is we've stopped doing what has been done in Australia for generations, or even 40,000 years, if you believe them. But now that the fires have been just these kinds of crazy fires, which like you can't stay home and defend your property from it. Like the fires,
it's just too intense.
It's just too intense. Now that this is becoming the new normal, the far left, because they basically control the means of communication, they're using this as proof that climate change is bad. So they've instituted policies using the excuse of climate change to make bushfire worse, and then blame that on climate change rather than their own policies.
Which is classic liberalism. You create the problem and then you provide the solution to the problem.
That's true.
And we just see this over and over again through time and through issue after issue. The same thing. They create the problem, they come in with the solution. No?
Well, just in support of what David just said, I saw a story a day or two ago about he's some Canberra billionaire who owns a massive property on the coast, and who had the foresight to employ a fire hazard reduction expert on his property. And when the bushfire came through, it was so effective. Not only was his property untouched, but it saved the surrounding community because it acted as a buffer to that bushfire. So it's just an example of how you can, if you want to, you can manage these issues. I mean, we live in, I think we all know this, in southeastern Australia, that's eucalyptus forests, and if you don't manage it, it's going to go up.
They're bombs.
Yep,
bombs waiting to go off. I find it interesting that the left is now, they're actually making a point of trying to they've been referring to these conspiracy theories about hazard reduction burns. They've actually had to respond to like the criticism that they haven't been doing the burning, they haven't been managing, because everybody's been so united, I think, in calling out their rubbish about climate change. So like Daniel Andrews has been making excuses saying it's because of climate change that we haven't been able to do the hazard reduction burns. I call BS on that.
Yeah.
There has been quite some attempt actually to suppress the voices saying the kinds of things that you're saying. I know on Twitter, for instance, on Australian Twitter, there's been a big doxing campaign so that anyone who is talking about this as being a part of the explanation, there's an attempt to suppress them through doxing.
Wow.
And which has led, I think it's good to say, it led to a counter movement, and I think 7,500 people asked Twitter to do something about the doxing, and finally they did actually.
Great.
So there's been pushback, is what I'm trying to say.
Excellent. Well, Cauldron Pool have pointed out that the ABC and SBS have altered their articles. The ABC took down an article talking about how there were these greenies who were blocking the burns, and like the original articles had these greenies holding up these signs saying backburning or whatever kills baby birds in their nests or something like this, and so now all those birds are dead, all billion of them.
Yeah, that's right.
The ABC have done something, SBS have done something similar. They originally quoted a scientist who was saying, look, it's not a causal link between climate change and the fires, and then they altered that to make it seem more doubtful. I loved the fact that there was the Israeli radio station that actually interviewed Tony Abbott, and he referred to the climate cult and said, no, there's no link between climate change and the bushfires, and then they had to apologise to their audience and referring to Tony Abbott as an extremist.
Well, it's interesting how this has gone international. It's been used for international propaganda,
Absolutely.
Isn't it? And
yes.
I was on holiday last week on the southwest coast of Victoria, and I was very amused to see that Australia, according to American television, I was being burnt alive by a bushfire down on the southwest coast of Victoria, where we were many hundreds of kilometres away from anything really. But all the doctored information, it's going international.
It just shows your professionalism, that even though you were burnt alive,
that's right.
You still
Yes.
We really appreciate that.
No, my
Yeah, you're still a little smoky.
I myself have suffered through the bushfires because I've had to defend Scott Morrison and the Greens.
yeah.
All these people saying, oh, the Greens did this, the Greens did that. Hold on, there's no Green government anywhere in Australia. There's Liberal governments, there's Labor governments. They're the ones who implemented these laws. As you were saying, it was the Liberals and the Nationals who locked up the national parks so that you couldn't do reduction burns in them.
Yes, that is an important one, because the hashtag It's the Greens' fault has been trending on Twitter, and I've been using that. And it is their fault, but what we've got...
But certainly they share responsibility.
Yeah, what we've got to sort of say is it's environmentalism and this cult of climate change.
Yes,
because
it's a cult
they've
of
all
climate
swallowed
change.
it. And the Greens are part of the just that very small establishment who make sure that anybody who actually questions their fake science is shouted down in public. They're part of the problem in that regard.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's what's going on here in Australia now is it's really vital from a cultural perspective, because the decisions that get made now in response to these bushfires will affect us for decades, because either Scott Morrison will stand firm and say, no, we've got to actually start managing the bush again, or he'll cave, or they'll do another Tony Abbott on him, and will only intensify the policies that have led to the current bushfires being so bad, and we'll be getting rid of more and more of our coal-fired power stations. That's the consequences of the battle, that public battle that's going on.
And there's a lot of pressure on him to cave, isn't there?
Yeah.
I've noticed that even the so-called conservative mainstream media have been running a lot of negative press against Scott Morrison.
Yeah. And
my instinct is to think, this is not to be taken at face value. It's a kind of a message to him, or it's the establishment, if you like.
The attacks on him have been full on.
Yeah.
And like I wrote on my blog, we should be hanging him for the crimes he's actually committed. Yes. And not for these nonsense things that he hasn't committed. The state governments are responsible for firefighting in the city, in the country. It's not a federal responsibility. He's not responsible for it. Sure, the government provides assistance and members of the armed forces and so forth, but really it's a state responsibility. And instead of the state premiers being roasted alive, they've turned all their attention onto the Prime Minister.
It's got all the makings of a classic setup.
Yeah.
The thing is as well, we could see what's going on now. We could see it coming like months ago. Like on XYZ, Adam Piggott's actually been very active. He started off writing about how in Perth there's a supposed water crisis.
Yep.
But then he analysed the fact that they haven't actually been managing the catchment areas around their dams, and so because the trees have been able to grow more, the more trees have been growing, more undergrowth, it's actually sucked up more of the water. And so because they actually haven't had a reduction in water, but they've had a reduction in dam levels there. And then we've just been analysing one by one, like just the failures in forest management across Australia, and we were talking about this a couple of months ago, and I was having a conversation with somebody before Christmas about how, like in Victoria, the Metropolitan Fire Brigade, how there's been those scandals here in Victoria, like to do with the unions and the CFA, the government minister resigned. Basically, the Metropolitan Fire Brigade has sort of spread its union tentacles throughout the whole of Victoria. Like it used to just be confined to a certain little spot.
It used to just be confined to Melbourne, and now they want to make it statewide.
Exactly, yeah. So they're spreading that union cancer throughout the whole of Victoria, which is affecting the effectiveness of bushfire fighting as well. So the volunteers, they still go out there, they risk their lives, they die.
That's right.
And they do,
firefighters have died.
Yeah, and they do everything they can. But it's like the government is doing everything it can to stop actual effective fighting of the bushfires, and then the media and the establishment, they just flog the same lie over and over again. It's climate change. Yeah.
just while we're talking about climate change, in my local newspaper, there's an article by a young woman who's a climate scientist, and no matter what the weather is locally, it's always evidence of climate change.
Yes.
And she made this claim a month or so ago that the average peak temperature in November was 4 degrees higher than 30 years ago. So I thought I'd actually go and look it up.
Mm-hmm.
And you can, on the Bureau of Meteorology website, find this information. And it was wrong.
Yeah.
And there's been a very slight cooling, in fact,
Yep.
over the last 10 years. So I just throw that out there in case. Yeah, I just think skepticism with some of this stuff is
There's some good websites around talking about, hey, be skeptical of climate change. And one of the arguments that they keep making when they talk about Australia's weather and how it's always proclaimed, it's the most extreme that it's ever been, blah, blah, blah. And they always say, if you take away all of the 1800s.
Yes.
If you take away the extreme weather events of the 1800s, then it's more extreme now. So what we're really experiencing is, in the 20th century, we actually had very stable weather conditions. And now it's returning to a more unstable.
In some of the research I've done...
If you can use that term.
In some of the research I've done, they point out that there were periods where temperatures were in the high 40s and low 50s.
Yeah.
And this isn't just Marble Bar we're talking about. This is Victoria, South Australia. They refer to this heat being blown out of the centre of Australia, and it was hot like a furnace.
Yes.
And I think from what I gather, from what I read, there was a point where they actually had to evacuate people from Adelaide in the middle of the 18th century.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So this stuff has been going on for a long time. Australia's always been like this. There's a government minister who was being interviewed by Tom Tilley on the ABC, and he pointed out that the first 20 years of the 21st century in Australia have been wetter than the first 20 years of the 20th century in Australia.
Yep.
And Tom Tilley just said, "Oh, well, that sounds like cherry picking to me." But no, it doesn't. You've been saying that the climate's been changing and we're hotter and drier now than we've ever been, but clearly it's not. It goes against the narrative, so it's cherry picking. Well,
it's not just this country either. In Britain they'll often say, this has been the hottest day on record. But officially, records only started in Britain in 1909. So before that, people kept records, but they weren't kept by the government. It was only in 1909 that the government actually said, hey, we'll set up an organisation to look after this.
And scientists keep going back over the old records and to find reasons why the old records are inaccurate, and they didn't. And it was actually colder back then than they said it was.
Yes.
They've been revising all the records down.
There's that famous email to her. One of the climate change activists said, "We have to get rid of the medieval warm period."
It's a little bit unfortunate.
One of the odd consequences of all this is that you have people now. The weather in Melbourne gets over 30, and people start to panic now. And I think back to the late 70s, early 80s, where you switch on the TV news and the weather presenter, who's usually an attractive young woman, would be saying, such lovely weather in Melbourne, it's 35 degrees and we've got 37 tomorrow, it's going to be great, and continuing on into next week. So it's gone from this is lovely weather to we're all about to die kind of mentality.
I must say it did used to annoy me when it's going to be 45 degrees tomorrow. It's so beautiful. No, it's not. Shut up.
I'm on the enjoying hot weather side, and I actually deliberately make a point of saying that I'm enjoying the weather when it's really hot, just because I know it triggers a lot of the lefties that
all right, I approve of that. I think we're coming up to time. I think we might end it there. Mark Richardson, can you tell us where people can find more of your thoughts?
They can find heaps of my thoughts going back some way. In fact, on Oz Conservative, which is just ozconservative.blogspot.com.au.
Yep. And your Twitter.
And also on Twitter, which is just Mark Richardson, if you look up Mark Richardson 2, I think I am. I think I'm number 2.
Oh, all right. I thought you were just Mark Richardson. Mark Richardson number 2. David.
Come to the XYZ, xyz.net.au. Let's encouraging everybody to bypass Facebook, just go straight to our site. If they want to follow us on social media, come to Gab or to Telegram, and you can hear me waffle on with Maddie on at Maddie Rose Live on Monday nights, 9:00, and also on the Uncuckables at 8:30 on Thursday. 8:30 on Thursday nights on YouTube.
And I'm Mark Moncrief, and you can find more of my thoughts on Upon Hope. Just type that into your favourite search engine and you'll find me. Thank you everyone, and have a good week.